What's going on, guys? We're back here with another episode of Watching the Meta, the weekly series where we take a look at the Magic Online results, sometimes some paper results. I can assure you there is one pretty important paper result that happened this past weekend, and we take a look and see what the metagame looks like. And what we usually do is we compare it to last week's. We kind of see if there's anything trending in terms of one deck picking up a lot in popularity, maybe a deck decreasing, and we always save a little bit of time for the Spice Corner. And we are going to start off the show, as we always do, with Modern. Now, to give you some context, there's 8 Modern challenges that happened between Friday and Sunday. So we have 8 challenges to kind of gather data from. In terms of the winners, there's a lot of spicy stuff here. 2 Blink and then a whole bunch of one-ups. Boros Energy, Goryo's, Breach, Orzhov, Necro. So definitely not one particular deck just kind of crushing multiple challenges. As far as the overall metagame is concerned, roughly about the same. I mean, a small dip in Breach, actually a pretty huge dip in Boros, which I'm kind of surprised to see Boros go from 18 to 11. And then Orzhov Blink, massive jump here from 8.7 to 17.6. And I think we all kind of have to associate that with the printing of Ketchermos and more people finally realizing how good Ketchermos truly is in this Orzhov deck. I believe this might be the first weekly meta series where Orzhov Blink is the #1 most played deck. This is the first time this has happened. Gruul Eldrazi, slight uptick. Everything else, nothing too crazy. One thing that I wanted to mention, you'll notice on the top left, Dimir Murktide 4.3%. There were some people last week who were playing Dimir Murktide instead of Dimir Oculus. I lumped them all into Dimir Oculus because I feel like there wasn't that many that were actually playing Murktide. But now, given how many people are actually switching to the card Murktide region and no Oculus, I did want to make sure that it had its own metagame share. So that's kind of what we're looking at for the metagame. Now, as far as decklists are concerned, we're going to start off with that Orzhov Necro deck. So this is a list from TGB12, who won one of the challenges this past weekend, and this is Necro Dominance, but with a little bit of a different take. So you kind of have the same usual stuff for Necro, and you really want to pair that with Shield of the Apocalypse, because you go turn 3 Necro, draw a couple cards, then next turn set up for Shieldred, draw your entire deck basically, and then kill them with Soul Spikes. But we are deciding to splash white for Ketchermos, where you actually do have a decent number of things that exile, where you have Relic of Progenitus paired with Ketchermos as just a massive amount of cards. You can pair Dothy Voidwalker with something like Fatal Push, where if you have Voidwalker in play and you push their creature, it just goes right to exile. And yeah, there's some cool stuff you can do with Ketchermos. Emperor of Bones as well can trigger it on your turn. Bogart Trawler, so a decent number of ways to do that. And yeah, really just kind of the usual suspects, like I said, Soul Spikes, Fell the Profane, bunch of Fatal Push and Thoughtseize, and just kind of splashing for Ketchermos. I guess I will say, it's not quite the same as traditional Necro decks because there is 4 Dothys to help supplement the Ketchermoses, but other than that, a pretty interesting take on the Necro deck, and maybe something that will potentially be a metagame player. I wanted to highlight this particular Eldrazi deck from SVESSESVV in 3rd place, and the reason for that is looks quite a bit different than maybe what you're used to. You're used to seeing a whole bunch of big cards like Emrakul and Worldbreaker and Devourer of Destiny, which, to be fair, still 1 copy of Devourer in the deck. But this is a much more aggressive approach where you have Eldrazi Linebreaker, which is 3/3 trample that you can give additional Eldrazi +X/+O in haste, where X is the number of Eldrazi you control, Glaring Fleshraker to get in some chip damage. We're even playing Thought-Knot Seer and Wastegate Battle Mage, so a lot of lower to the ground stuff. Now, I don't necessarily know if this is the best approach, but I think the concept is the Breach matchup is not ideal, right? So potentially the way to beat the Breach matchup is just try to kill them before they get set up. I'm not sure that this deck has the capability of doing that, given that Breach can kill on turn 2, but Disruption, backed up by Pressure, is a reasonable recipe in order to beat Breach, and maybe that's good enough. Maybe it's not. Time will tell. I'm going to have to give this one a try. The Chalice's main deck do kind of help a little bit too, because you can Chalice for 0 against Breach. But yeah, just wanted to highlight this as a slightly different take on the Eldrazi deck. It wouldn't be an episode of Watching the Meta unless we talked about Deceiver Exarch and its partner in crime, Splinter Twin. Chahi top-8'd a Modern Challenge this weekend with Grixis Twin. So you have the usual Deceiver Exarch, Splinter Twin, kind of the, I guess you would say the wizard package, although there's only one Flame of Aenor, and then you have 4 Flare of Denial and 4 Force Negation. Flare, quite good with Thundertrap Trainer. Tamiyo as well as another wizard that also draws you a bunch of cards, pairs very well with Flame of Aenor. But instead of just being blue-red, we are splashing black for Psychic Frog and Fatal Push, and I believe there might have been some... No, there's no black cards in the sideboard. But yeah, Psychic Frog and Fatal Push are the black splashes here. There's also Dismember, which you certainly can cast for black mana, not its intended purpose. But I think I like the Psychic Frog splash a lot here because you can kind of attack from multiple different angles where you play Frog on turn 2, they have to answer it, and then ideally, if they answer it, that's one less kill spell that they have for Exarch. So I think it makes a lot of sense, and I'm not a Twin guy myself, but if I were interested in Twin, this list looks pretty clean. And last but not least, it's Belcher without the Belcher? From Draco 09 in 20th place. So what we have here is a bunch of MDFC, so Bane Veil, Jwari Disruption, Salundi Vision, Sink into Stupor, Seagate Restoration, and Hydroelectric Specimen. So you're kind of used to all that if you've seen any of the Mono Blue Belcher decks. You're pairing that with the counter spells, Flare of Denial, Force Negation, and Disrupting Shoal, so you have a whole bunch of free counters, but instead of playing with Tameshi, Lotus Bloom, Goblin Charbelcher, you're playing with Selective Memory, which is a card that says you can search for any number of non-land cards and exile them. Every card in your deck is a non-land card, so you can technically pay 4 mana to just exile your entire library. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, you have a card called Thassa's Oracle. I'm sure you've seen this before if you've seen Breach. So what happens is, you play the Selective Memory, you exile everything in your deck except the 2 copies of Thassa's Oracle. You have 2 cards in your deck. You draw for turn, you guessed it, hey, it's a Thassa's Oracle. You also have 1 Chase as kind of a third win condition that can help you win without a library. And the new card here, which I've seen actually pick up a little bit in popularity, is Stock Up, where really good in combo decks if you're trying to set up specifically A plus B, because looking at 5 cards and getting 2 of them, you get to look at a whole bunch of cards and you can take 2 combo pieces. So it makes a lot of sense. Just an interesting take on the Belcher deck. I would assume week 2 the same things that Belcher is week 2, like White Orchid Phantom, Ghost Quarter, that kind of stuff. Just a different take, and I figured I would show this one because Stock Up. Stock's going up. Next up, we're going to take a pretty quick look here at Pioneer. Well, not much has changed. Last week, 17.5% Demons, small downtick, and the 2% that Rakdos Demons lost just went to Gruul Prowess, so they kind of just flip-flopped. They literally did flip-flop exactly, which I think is pretty funny. Dimir Bounce, a little bit of an uptick from 9 to 13. Rakdos Prowess, huge downtick here. I remember when we kind of assumed for the longest time that it was going to be a 2-deck format for as long as possible, and at least that dynamic has shifted a little bit. More people are picking up Bounce. Rakdos Prowess players are switching to Gruul Prowess, so I can at least appreciate that. Boros Burn, about the same. Phoenix, small uptick. Nothing else really worth noting. There's some upticks in Azorius and Celestia Company, but nothing too major. Yeah, really, the only notable thing here is the big dip in Rakdos Prowess and the slight uptick in Dimir Bounce. So that's all I got as far as the metagame is concerned, but we do have some interesting decks to take a look at that may or may not feature Aetherdrift cards. And the first one that I want to showcase to you guys is my pet card, in Standard at least. And Strangled Angles has decided to play it in Pioneer, and a card that has been a huge boon to the deck in Standard has been Bright Glass Gearhulk, and kind of makes sense to put it in the Pioneer version. What's interesting to me about this Cage deck compared to the ones that are in Standard is there's no elves, no Elvish Mystic, no Llanowar Elves. The 1-drops that we have here are Teething Wormlet and Thraben Inspector. I was going to say Novice, but it actually is Thraben Inspector. My guess is probably because you can play the retro ones, so that would probably be the reason why you would play Thraben over Novice. But I like these 1-drops because Teething Wormlet is pretty interesting since it can get to a unique power point, and it's a 1-mana creature that grows. So, say for example, you go Wormlet and then, maybe play a Cage on turn 2. That's a 2-power Wormlet. Then the next turn, another artifact, 3-power. So you can get the Wormlet to power point that you don't really have otherwise in your other cheap cards. And the same thing with Ingenious Smith, where you kind of have this package deal of Smith plus Wormlet, and it really allows you to grow the team. Brightglass Gearhulk can fetch stuff like Giant Killer, Paw Patch Recruit, Skrelv, and Haywire Mite, along with Shadow Spear, Portable Hole, and Duskgrow. So you do have a lot of good targets there. You'll notice no Overlord of the Mistmoors. That's because we have a better version of Overlord of the Mistmoors that also happens to be a land. So we can kind of cheat on the land count a little bit, while also still having a good hit off of Collector's Cage, which is pretty nice. Next deck I have for you here from Andrew, 1232 in 13th place. This is what the Dimir bounce decks are mostly looking like. The reason I wanted to highlight this one is due to the presence of 4 copies of Oil Deep Gearhulk, which is not something that really any of the other Dimir bounce decks in Pioneer have, so I wanted to highlight that. As far as everything else is concerned, it's probably cards you would have expected in this deck, so you have a lot of the standards carryovers: Hopeless Nightmare, Momentum Breaker, Nowhere to Run, Storm Chasers. You get the Pioneer 8-pack of Best Disruption of all time and 4 Fatal Push and 4 Thoughtseize. You get Narset to help find your pieces and help a good card to reset with Yorion. This is an 80-card deck, by the way. So, yeah, I mean, it's a lot of 4-ofs. It's a lot of cards that you would expect. Just wanted to highlight this one specifically because of the 4 Oil Deep Gearhulks. Next up from K-Burb, who got 3rd place in one of the challenges this weekend, with Esper Greasefang, featuring 4 copies of Monument to Endurance, which I think is pretty interesting in the Greasefang shell. Greasefang is a deck that is typically very weak to graveyard hate, more so than a lot of the other strategies, because if you look at the win conditions in this deck outside of Greasefang, there's really not much else here. Sometimes in the past they've played Kaido if you're playing Esper, you could play like some version of Chandra, other Planeswalker if you're playing Mardu. But the really cool thing that Monument does is it gives you a way to win the game that does not utilize the graveyard. So you can pair your discard outlets like Cure the Rising Tide, Faithful Mending, Indulgence, Collector Brutality. You can pair that with Monument to drain out your opponent if they have a lot of graveyard hate. You also have Vanishing Verse, which can take care of Rest in Peace, and that's kind of cool. And yeah, just wanted to kind of highlight this one. Really not utilizing the traditional discard outlets like Fear of Missing Out that you see in the Mardu Greasefang decks, but kind of using Faithful Mending and Tainted Indulgence instead of those. And the last one I have for you here today is from Taimu in 25th place with Repurposing Bay. Now, you may have seen this deck in Standard. It actually had a couple of people who played it at the Pro Tour. So basically the concept is you're utilizing Repurposing Bay, which is the new Birthing Pod-esque type artifact from Aetherdrift, and you're pairing that with the Enigma Jewel, where Jewel gives you the 2 mana to just immediately activate the Repurposing Bay. Now, the big difference between Pioneer and Standard is the Standard version has to play the Radiant Lotus to be able to, you get a 5 into play, you sacrifice the 5, go get the Lotus, sack all your artifacts, make a bunch of mana, and then Boommobile them. This deck doesn't quite have to do that. You can actually stop the chain at 5, go get Paradox Engine, and you can utilize Paradox Engine plus other cheap spells, cheap artifacts to make a whole bunch of mana, because you have Moonsnare Prototype, you can Prophetic Prism off of Enigma Jewel, you can tap the Enigma Jewel itself, so you have enough artifacts alongside maybe some Power Stones from Thranspider to make a bunch of mana, cast cheap artifacts, untap all your permanents, make a bunch more mana, and then eventually you get to enough mana to Boommobile them. The other really interesting thing about this deck list is there's not a single copy of Simulacrum Synthesizer. So we have kind of totally eschewed that angle of the deck, which is very interesting in favor of just some more cheap artifacts like Terrarian, again, the aforementioned Paradox Engine, Moonsnare Prototype, still have the Chainsaws, stuff like that, and then you have Glintnest Crane, which is another addition that you get in Pioneer to help find the combo pieces, which sounds pretty interesting. And the last format we're going to be taking a look at today is Standard. Now, for those of you who don't know, there was a standard Pro Tour that happened this past weekend. So this metagame data that you see is the 4 challenges that happened on Magic Online combined with the PT Top 32 metagame. Now, I'm going to show you the separate actual Pro Tour metagame we're going to do that differently, because looking at just the top 32 of the Pro Tour doesn't necessarily show you all of the decks that were played. So we're going to look at the PT metagame separately in a second. But just wanted to highlight this in terms of comparing between MTGO data last week. So domain last week was 21%. This week it's dipped a little bit down to 16.9, which is a little surprising given it was 3 out of the top 8 of the Pro Tour. Spoilers. Grow Prowess, the exact same, 15.6. Esper Pixie, about the same. Nothing too crazy there. Jeskai Convoke, bit of a downtick. Dimir Midrange, small uptick. Other than that, nothing else is too outstanding. What I will say is there was a decent uptick in Mono Red, where last week it was almost nowhere to be seen. This week at 5%. And new kid on the block, Orzhov Pixie, non-existent last week to 6.3% this week. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that Ben Stark went undefeated on day 1 with the Pixie deck, so more people were picking it up for the challenges over the weekend. Now, as I was alluding to earlier, as far as the total Pro Tour metagame is concerned, this is not just top 32, this is the entire field. So 18% Gruul Mice, 16% Pixie, 15% Domain, which is a little bit different than what we were looking at in the Magic Online results. Not terribly different. Pixie is a little bit higher, Gruul's slightly higher, Domain is roughly about the same. And then Jeskai Oculus, from there it sort of dips off pretty big, 3.2, 2.6 for Dimir Midrange, so on and so forth. But as far as the big 3 are concerned, you see it's not that much different between the Pro Tour metagame and the Magic Online metagame. As far as deck lists, so we are certainly going to be taking a look at some Pro Tour deck lists, but the one MTGO result that I wanted to highlight here is in 8th place from the Slickshot gang, somehow not playing Slickshot Show Off. They're actually playing a blue-white blink deck. So this deck is kind of centered around the card Fortune Loyal Steed, which is a way to kind of flicker your other creatures. You're pairing that with, I guess there's only 1 Parting Gust in the deck, but 2 Charming Prince as well. So you have a couple of ways to flicker your own things. And what are we flickering? Well, you have Channeler that does pretty much anything, can make a bird, can return a creature, or draw a card. Flickering Baze is pretty cool. Flickering Flood Pits Drowner to lock down more stuff. Flickering Loran of the Third Path. You can play Steel Seraph for 3 mana and then flicker that as I click on the Steel Seraph that I didn't mean to do. And then Riptide Gearhulk as well. I mean, it's a little expensive, but once you start flickering that, you can put more permanents on top from your opponent. And yeah, this deck list looks pretty interesting. Definitely something I may have to give a try myself. And we even have the Elish Norn to even more double up on all of our blink stuff. So thought this one was kind of cool. But after this, we're going to be taking a look at some PT decks. So the first deck from the Pro Tour that we're going to be taking a look at is the one that I alluded to earlier. This is the Orzhov Pixie deck from Ben Stark, who I believe finished with a constructed record of 8-1-1. So good job, Ben. Didn't quite make the top 8. Had a bit of a rough run in draft. But this deck was super interesting. Now, when you hear Pixie, you kind of assume maybe a little bit lower to the ground, much more aggressive with Optimistic Scavenger, utilizing chip damage from Hopeless Nightmare, which is kind of what Ben did, but not entirely. So we took the aggressive nature of the Pixie deck because I do think you need the Pixie Nightmare draws in order to have a chance against Domain. But instead of playing a lot more of the lower to the ground stuff like Scavenger, Fear of Isolation, things of that nature, we're playing more 3-drops. So we have 2 Lauren of the Third Path main, 4 Temporary Lockdown, 4 Unholy Annex, and 3 Liliana of the Veil. So what that does is it allows you to play a bit more of a mid-range game, where against opposing Pixie decks, not only do you have main deck lockdown to lock everything up, you also can just be the control deck in those matchups, where you just play kill your creature, Pixie, pick up my kill spell. Once you have a clear board, then you can slam a Liliana or slam an Annex and just kind of use your powerful 3-drops to bridge to the late game. The other thing that Black-White does over Esper is it gives you a better mana base. So you'll notice that Ben has 3 Soul Stone and 3 Restless Fortress. That's 6 creature lands, which again plays alongside those 3-drops where Ben wants to play a longer game in the Pixie Mirrors. And I think he did a pretty good job of potentially doing that. This deck list looks sick. Be on the lookout for a video with it, probably coming out soon. Speaking of people who crushed it at the PT, this deck list is the Golgari Obliterator deck that did extremely well this past weekend in the hands of one Christopher Larson, who went 9-1 in the constructed portion. 9-1 with Phyrexian Obliterator? What year is it? The other individual who played this deck list was Javier Dominguez, who unfortunately finished 5-5 in the constructed rounds. But this deck was really carried on the back of that massive performance by Larson. Now, really, there's not a ton of new cards here, but quite possibly one of the most important printings for a deck like this is just another dual land, because it's very hard to support green cards plus quad black. So really, this is just a Golgari mid-range deck with a slightly different take on the mana base. Now, part of playing Phyrexian Obliterator is you don't get to play Llanowar Elves because you need to play a bunch of swamps to support the Obliterators, so you lose that aspect. But it kind of sort of makes your deck a little bit better against the cheap kill spells anyways, so maybe that's a plus. But yeah, you have Bushwhack as well as kind of like the big combo with Obliterator, where if you have Obliterator in play, you can have your Obliterator fight their creature, they sack a whole bunch of permanents, and everybody's happy. So yeah, be on the lookout for a YouTube video soon, maybe? Next up, we have the Izzet Artifacts deck that was played by Remy Roudier to a 7-3 finish in the constructed portion of the event. Now, similar to its Pioneer counterpart that we talked about earlier, this deck is built around Repurposing Bay. Now, as I mentioned previously, the goal of this deck is eventually get to Radiant Lotus, sacrifice all your artifacts for mana, and then put that mana into Boom Mobile. This particular version is built around Simulacrum Synthesizer, so I would say that most of the time, your goal is to just put as many of these into play as possible and not really go towards the combo. But it is something you have access to, where if you draw a copy of Radiant Lotus, then you can make a whole bunch of mana, go get a Boom Mobile, kind of pop off from there. The new innovation here, because I've seen people try Repurposing Bay decks before the PT, but the new innovation that I hadn't seen before was Memory Guardian. And this is pretty cool because it is a cheap way to trigger Synthesizer, but also a 5-drop that you can sack to go find the Radiant Lotus. But it also is just a cheap 3/4 flyer, so it kind of helps in your beatdown plan, helps you trigger Synthesizer, so it's good when you have that, but it's also sort of a combo piece because you can sacrifice it to go find the Lotus. So I thought that was kind of interesting, and this deck looks pretty sweet. And last but certainly not least, quite possibly the spiciest deck of the weekend that did actually quite well in the hands of Zevin Foss to top-8'd the event. As you can see here, an 8-2 constructed record for Zevin. And Zevin played Golgari Graveyard. So this is a deck list that is based around, I mean, look, it's up the beanstalk, but it's not in domain. So does it really count as up the beanstalk? Let me know in the comments. So the whole idea of this deck is you're playing a bunch of self-mills. You have Cenote Scout, Gnawing Vermin, Molt Tender, and Overlord of the Balemerc. So a lot of ways to fill up the graveyard with creatures, and then you're playing cards that get discounted by the number of creatures that are in your graveyard. So Huskburster Swarm, Hollow Marauder, Chitin Gravestalker, and Overwhelming Remorse are all cards that have a pretty high mana value if you look in the top right-hand corner, but all cards that can get discounted based on cards in graveyard, and they all happen to trigger up the beanstalk. I will mention, for those who want to play this deck at home, there was an interview with Zevin, and I believe Zevin said that he wished he had cut the Molt Tenders for Rubble Belt Mavericks, so keep that in mind if you want to play this at home. But yeah, I mean, a really, really cool take. The other card that I want to shout out here before I let you all go is Souls of the Lost. Souls is nice because it's an additional payoff, but it's a card that you can cast even early on. Say your mills are a little bit worse and you hit a bunch of lands and up the beanstalks and less creatures, you can still cast Souls of the Lost even with not an abundance of creatures in the graveyard and still have it be a relevant card, which is kind of nice. And you can sacrifice creatures to it, so you can sack any of your 1-mana enablers to the souls, get an extra creature in the graveyard, have a big blocker, so on and so forth. So, really cool list from Zevin, and yet again, be on the lookout for a YouTube video. And that is going to do it for another episode of Watching the Meta. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed. Be sure to let me know in the comment section down below which one of these decks would you like to see for a future video. And until next time, adios.